Happy Earth Day. Will you pray with me this morning? Dear God, creator of all things, thank you for the earth. Thank you for the beauty of her creation, for the amazing ways that she supports us, nourishes us, provides for us, and all the other creatures and creations living here together. Please guide us to be in better relationship with the earth and therefore with you. Amen. So about a month ago, I found myself feeling really antsy. It was the end of the winter that never wanted to end. It was mid-semester, so I was swamped by books and reading all the time. And I'm one of those people who likes to get out of my routine and try something new every now and then. So I texted my dad, and I said, I need to get out of the city. Can we go on a hike? And he texted me back and he said, okay, sure. And this was a funny moment for me. Because I'm a city kid. I grew up in New York City. I don't know how to drive a car. I am at home in the anonymity of the crowds and the buildings. So this thought that I needed to get out of the city was new for me. At first, I kind of came to terms with it, just like, yeah, I grew up with my dad, this white guy who took us camping all the time. So it must have rubbed off at some point. But then I realized that actually, no, this is me. I need to be among nature, and I know that because I have experienced a deep connection to the land. When I went to the Philippines to live for a couple years, as many of you have already heard, that's in my text, so thank you. I experienced deep transformation of my life and spirituality. What came with that, or maybe what was the root of that, I don't know, was an understanding that I belonged to the land. Whenever I could, I would take a trip out of the smog that is Manila, and whenever I got off the bus and was with the land, I felt a visceral sense of rootedness to place. The land told me that I belonged. I went to the Philippines on a soul-searching identity sort of journey, but this was not something that I could have gotten in the same way from the people. As someone mixed and who grew up in the United States, I did not exactly fit in all the time, which makes sense. But for the most part, people would tell me that I was Filipino after all, one minute, and then comment on how American I was the next. So it was not really a very conclusive affirmation. But what I found in my soul was that it was possible to not fit in with the people and still belong to the land. So here I am back in New York feeling a need for intimacy with the land because I've experienced it. I know that this connection exists. I have experienced God in much of the same way. And so I know that God and land speak to me together. So what does that mean to be one with the land? I think there's some wisdom about this to be found in our text this morning. This teaching from Jesus comes from the Sermon on the Mount. Early in his ministry, Jesus had drawn large crowds, and so at this moment, he had gone up on a mountain and sat to teach them. The part of this monologue that we enter then has Jesus teaching about the Jewish law. He says, "Do not think I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished." A newcomer to the field, Jesus wanted to be clear. The law still stands. While he may have had issues with the leaders of the Jewish communities, he does not criticize the teachings of the faith. He goes even farther. He gives examples articulating his interpretation of how we should follow these laws. For example, the law says that you should not murder, and Jesus says that you should not even get angry. The law says that you should not commit adultery, and Jesus says that you should not even look at a woman and have lust, which in this context is a desire for another man's property, but that is another sermon for another day. The law says, take an eye for an eye, and Jesus says you should turn the other cheek. Jesus, far from opposing the Jewish laws, is making them even harder to follow. So what on earth is Jesus trying to get at here? Is the kingdom of God some exclusive club for the perfect and pure? Actually, if we look at what Jesus is saying, his goal is to get to the root of the teaching. The function of the law against murder is to maintain harmony with the community. Therefore, Jesus says, when you are angry, you are liable to judgment. It doesn't say if you have an angry feeling, you will be smited. It says if you have a problem with your brother or sister, go first and make it right with them, and then come back to the altar with your offerings. The law stating an eye for an eye is actually intended to maintain justice, saying that a punishment should be equal to the crime. Jesus, however, takes it one step further, saying that we should have mercy. So how does this translate to land? What Jesus is articulating is a relationship with one another that fosters a reciprocal relationship between all creation. Making peace with your brother or sister, rather than sitting in anger and allowing it to escalate, makes for a more mutual relationship. If someone has wronged you, and then they choose to apologize, both genuinely and thoroughly, and make peace, how much more willing are you then to apologize when you do wrong? Growing up, I remember the moments when my parents would apologize if they had not been fair or acted rashly. And that has infinitely shaped my ability to apologize to others and believe in people, even when they've done wrong to me. In the law of an eye for an eye, while promoting justice, it also creates a transactional relationship. What if rather than an eye for an eye, we promoted restorative justice, encouraging a reciprocal relationship and the space to know that mistakes happen and there's room for grace and support? Now let us also remember, the word for human in Hebrew is Adam, and Adam is made from Adamah, which means ground or earth. We are both made from and inhabit earth, and in doing so are in inextricable relationship with it. Therefore today on Earth Day, we must listen to the earth, that we might know how to live in reciprocal relationship according to God's law. So Ruben and I were in Prospect Park in Brooklyn last week, just walking around on that one day that it was really warm. And we came upon this old 18th century house built by a Dutch family that's now sort of like a museum. The sign out front said that the Lenape, the indigenous people, used to occupy this land. Their lifestyle consisted of coming into the land, burning a portion of it to grow crops and living on it for a while, and then after a time, they would allow the forest to grow back, and they would move on to live somewhere else. When the Dutch came in, they settled the land, clearing the forest and building houses. They then lived with a monocrop system, growing the same crops in the same land over and over again, depleting the soil. This is nothing we find surprising. Non-indigenous people come and colonize a land only to extract its resources and not give back. However, in the relationship of the Lenape with the land, we can see illustrated the fundamental concept that the law of the land is that earth is constantly renewing. There is life, there is growth, there is death and decay, but it all happens in an equilibrium of supporting systems that renew and restore the earth to continue to foster more life. There's a cycle of give and take that supports life when we participate in doing our part. However, the history of colonization and separation from the land puts us instead into a linear understanding of progress and growth. We're taught from the beginning, you go to school, you get a job, you make money, you get married, and you have kids. It's just this one line of success. For businesses, the model revolves around profit. Profits must be exponentially growing. That's how you appease investors. That's how you show success. And this move from reciprocal relationship and a cycle of renewal instead provides an escape from accountability. If we only look forward, then there's no time or need to give back. Development models for countries create a linear progression based on the path that European and the United States have taken. From agriculture to industry, from rural to urbanization, with all this has come technological development, and now we are taught to believe that the developed nations are the solution to creating technology that can be our progress that can make our progress more sustainable and eco-friendly. I was at an event on Tuesday, and I heard this woman speaking about the development of a particular part of the Philippines into what will be known as a green city. It's an area north of Manila that is primarily a mountain region. Initially, it was occupied by indigenous people called the Aita. They're still around but have been heavily displaced from their land. It was first taken over by the upper-class Filipinos in the area. And then in 1903, after the United States took over as colonizer from Spain, the area was turned into Clark Air Force Base. The base was heavily used by the Japanese during the occupation of the Philippines and by the United States during the Cold and the Vietnam Wars. The base, in 1991, fun fact, the year I was born, a nearby volcano blew up and caused damage to the base. Now, this led to the U.S. then handing the base back over to the Philippine government. And then now it's like, but the troops have been coming back. And then there's threats from China, so they're letting the U.S. come back in. But now they're talking about developing it into a green city. There's a Harvard graduate leading the way, seeking to create a walkable, bikeable city offering affordable housing and attracting manufacturers and technology firms to provide high-quality jobs. However, it's unclear how many of the 20,000 tenant farmers will be displaced. Now, what sense does that make as a development model? To go from indigenous people to colonizers to sustainable development that will continue to displace people who work in closest relationship with the land. Driven by profit, it does not hear the earth cry out. We have this perspective that undeveloped nations must pass through the development patterns of the wealthy white supremacist nations without recognizing that the development of these nations is the reason the earth's resources have been consumed 4 times more than the earth can renew. We have not accounted for the fact that the forces behind our climate crisis are the extraction of renewable and non-renewable resources from our planet, processing and distributing them, and consuming them globally while seeking cheaper resources and lower wages for the interest of private gain. It does not acknowledge that those facing the consequences of climate change are not those primarily responsible for creating it. When Jesus speaks of fulfillment of the law, he states in verse 20, "For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." From reading the rest of the gospel story, we can tell that this is just shade. Jesus does not have a high opinion of the Pharisees and the scribes. Rather, he's saying that the scribes and the Pharisees may not have murdered someone or committed adultery or taken more than an eye for an eye, but they may have checked all the boxes of the written law, but that does not make their way of living in line with God's intention. The linear progress of success that we exist in is not in line with God's intention. Rather, we must do better than the scribes and the Pharisees, not in success or climbing the status ladder, but in moral integrity. We have to learn to live in right relationship with one another. In a way that promotes life and renewal and love, we must treat the land as we would treat ourselves, because we are also the land. I think many of us come with various stages of connection and or rupture and or displacement from a relationship with nature or land, be it because of immigration, colonization, or conquest, and or just living in the city. And in this process, the voice of the land and creation has become silenced. In many ways, I think it contributes to our inability to even conceptualize the climate crisis that we face today. Our linear progression has gone too far. There is no cycle of return. And as we grapple with our separation from the land, we mourn the loss of understanding the cycle and our connection with the land from which we were created. Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak, known to be one of the big 3 post-colonial theorists, speaks on decolonization saying, "The point is not to recover a lost consciousness, but to see the itinerary of the silencing." She is articulating that our healing comes not in living a new life all over again with only indigenous wisdom, but it is in looking at how history and corruption and power and greed has chosen to silence that which we already know to be true. The final verse in our reading this morning acts as a sort of summation of the goals of the Sermon on the Mount. It's known as the Golden Rule. Jesus is actually not the first person to state this rule, but it appears in our Bible, and Christianity gets a lot of the credit for it. In it, Jesus states, "In everything, do unto others as you would have them do to you, for this is the law and the prophets." But what does this mean to treat one another as we would like to be treated? I always hear this phrase with a bit of hesitation, because what I would do for myself is not always what others want or need. I don't have any authority to dictate your needs or desires, and I would not want anyone, as some sort of universal law, to believe that they know just what I need. Now, in thinking about the ways in which we live in the silence, I've been drawn to think about my skin. I've been having skin problems since I got back from the Philippines, which at this point has been about 2 years. Now, growing up, I had eczema, which is a bit of an issue as a swimmer, allergic to chlorine. But after a big rash outbreak when I was like 13, I pretty much had it under wraps. In terms of acne, I went through normal teenage puberty, but nothing I ever really worried about. But interestingly enough, when I went to the Philippines, I had zero issue. I'm sure I got a pimple here or there, but I never needed lotion. I never had an outbreak. That humidity did wonders for feeling comfortable in my own skin. But when I got back 2 years ago, I began to experience skin problems. I started getting acne more persistently than I had before, and I pick at my face, so it only makes it worse. I started having rough patches on my rib cage. I went to the doctor that first summer, and they gave me some over-the-counter ointment, but basically told me he didn't know what it was. So to myself, I just said, this was a product of being back in the U.S. empire. I mean, come on. The food we eat, the stressful environment, and this cold, dry climate is just not what God intended for my body. Now, in dealing with it, what I mostly did was ignore it. I tried Proactive for a couple months. I've used some oils Lisa gave me for a couple months, but in 2 years, it still hasn't been resolved. This past December, I had another flare-up and developed this rash on my hand, which has never happened before. My usual hydrocortisone didn't do much, and it eventually really did start to bother me because it was like middle of winter, my skin cracked, and it hurt, and it would get really itchy. So I have a friend at school who's a pretty well-established homeopathic doctor, and she gave me some salve that helped a little bit, but it was still just lingering. So finally, a couple weeks ago, Ruben and I went to Florida for a quick vacation. I needed to get out of the city still. So we were like, okay, we're going somewhere warm. And we spent the first day at the beach, and I swam in the ocean. And parts of my rash seemed to dry up and fall off. The second day, I swam in the ocean again, and it continued to help. I came back to New York and showed my friend, and she said, maybe it's your minerals. So she gave me these little chalky tablet things. They're tiny. They just dissolve in your mouth. And the label says they are a combination of 12 mineral cell salts, vital to cellular health and function, brings balance back to overall cell function. So reading that actually then reminded me, when I came back to the United States, not only was I coming back to the U.S. empire, I was also still recovering from having contracted tuberculosis. For those of you who were in the church back then, you may have heard that in the last few months before I left, I was diagnosed with tuberculosis after having an enlarged lymph node in my neck. It was never in my lungs, so from what I understood, I had low immunity, and what had already been latent in my blood, probably from when I was a child and born in the Philippines, had activated. So I'm not complaining. It could have been worse. I didn't have a cough or any other symptoms, and I had access to the best health care in Manila. But it was a lot of medication. And I wonder now if my body had recovered after the illness was gone. I took these little chalky tablets for a week, and the skin on my hand is almost back to normal. It's been 4 months of nothing helping, and taking supplements to support my cellular health and function is bringing the greatest healing to my hand. So I think about the ways that my body was telling me something was wrong, and I wasn't listening to it. That which I already knew, I was willing to forget. I was willing to silence just in order to survive. So what purpose does that silencing serve? Lost in the need to produce work and school, be a productive partner and friend, and whatever else I was doing, I was choosing to silence that which was telling me I needed renewal. But the land called me back. The land took me to the ocean, and the ocean helped to restore the balance. So it is amidst this renewal that we are to understand how to treat ourselves, treat others, and treat the earth. So now on Earth Day, we have an invitation to interrogate that which has been silenced by our linear progression of life. We're invited to live in reciprocal relationship with the earth, and to do so better than the Pharisees and the scribes. We are called back to the land, to recognize that despite our city nature, that we are from the earth and accountable to how we treat it, and that in doing so, we are living in God's intention. Happy Earth Day.